Germany and Japan after that war. The fact that they were prohibited from concentrating on defense and military things allowed them to put all of their efforts into rebuilding economically and commercially. And this allowed them to re-emerge on the world scene much quicker than might have been imagined. The Carthaginians did exactly this thing after the Second Punic War. They had always been a great money-making commercial state, and they went right back to work making money. As a matter of fact, they were led early on, we're told, or at least partially led, by the great Hannibal himself. He seems to have gone into government, become a senator of some note, and maybe gone after the rich people in Carthage and said, you need to pony up some extra money and we'll get out of this hole that the Romans have put us in. In fact, he becomes such a threat that another faction in Carthage, and it's interesting, both Hannibal and Scipio will essentially have their careers destroyed through what we would call today partisan politics. Some of these enemies of Hannibal, these other politicians, sent an emissary to Rome saying, you need to come over and see what Hannibal's doing. And it seems like they may have played upon the fears of the Romans that they always had of the Barcas, these sworn enemies of the Roman state. Also, the last thing the Romans wanted was the Carthaginians getting back on their feet real quickly. So a delegation is said to have gone to Carthage to have a discussion with Hannibal. And Hannibal flees. He has a real suspicion that these Romans are going to kill him or take him back to Rome. So he gets out of Carthage and he leaves and he never comes back. We're told that he continues to flee from place to place over the years, just getting away ahead of the Roman, I guess you might call it the Secret Service or the Special Forces, that seem to be trailing him every step. Rome wants Hannibal dead or brought back to Rome, and he manages to elude these pursuers for many years. It also looks to me like he's continually looking for some club to attack the Romans with. Like that oath that he took with his father as a little boy was still foremost in his mind. For example, at one point he would flee to the court of Antiochus, the king of the Seleucids in Asia. And the historians make it seem as though he's providing military support and help and advice to the Seleucids. You know, you're going to face the Romans eventually, let me tell you how you beat them. He's supposed to have told them that you actually have to go to Italy if you want to beat the Romans. You have to attack Italy. You can't just sit back. The Seleucid king at one point is supposed to have held a military parade and shown his army off to Hannibal and said something to the effect of, well, do you think these will be enough for the Romans? Meaning, do you think these will be enough to beat the Romans? Hannibal's supposed to have replied, yes, this should be enough, even for the Romans, meaning the Romans were going to almost drown in their blood when they ripped through this Seleucid army, which they did in 189 BC. Now, whether Hannibal was there or not, we don't know. We just know that when the Romans came to accept the surrender of Antiochus, one of the terms of the deal was turn over Hannibal. So Hannibal fled again. Eventually, the Roman Secret Service or spies or whomever it was that was continually chasing Hannibal would corner him in the area near the Black Sea today. And we're told that Hannibal's house had all these hidden secret passageways so he could escape if the Romans showed up, because they were always showing up. And when the Romans surprised him at this house, he's supposed to have asked his servants to run down and see if any of those secret passageways were clear, and they came back up and reported that none of them were. There were men stationed at every exit. At this point, in 183 BC, at the age of 64, Hannibal opens up a secret compartment in his ring, we're told, that he always had with him, that contained poison. And one of the ancient historians says that his last words were, "Let us ease the Roman people of their continual care, who think it long to await the death of an old man." And he kills himself.
Yeah, he does.
Interestingly enough, this same year, 183 BC, would be the year that his main adversary and one of the other greatest generals of the ancient world would also die, probably of some illness, exiled from Rome, self-exile. You see, Scipio Africanus, after the Carthaginian triumph, did not fare so well in Rome. He was dealing with the same sort of problems Hannibal was, what we would call today partisan politics. He and his brother go on to some military campaigns in Greece, and some of their adversaries, perhaps worried about the growing power of this family, accused Scipio's brother of financial misappropriation, in other words, being crooked. And we're told that Scipio arrives in front of the Roman Senate, obviously angry that they would ever question him, the most revered man in Roman politics, this great figure, and he is supposed to have taken his brother's accounting books from the campaign in question and ripped them up in front of the Roman Senate and thrown them at the senator's feet. And since it was the anniversary of his great victory, we're told, at Zama, he marched out of the Senate chambers and said that he was going to go thank the gods for his victory back at Zama, and a huge crowd just marched with him to go do the same thing. In other words, he had the crowd with him. But he was so disgusted with the partisan politics and the ungratefulness of his people that he exiled himself to another part of Italy, dying there the same year Hannibal died, and we're told that his epitaph read, "Ungrateful fatherland, thou hast not even my bones." Angry. Both men dying angry.
Oh boy.
At their country. Now Carthage continues to recover, even without Hannibal. We're told that they shock the Romans 10 years after the Second Punic War ends by offering to repay the war indemnity that's set at 50 years long, because that's how long the Romans thought they'd need to pay it. The Carthaginians come back after 10 and offer to pay the whole thing off. The shocked Romans say no. They want the Carthaginians to be reminded every year when they have to pay it that they're defeated. But after 50 years, the Carthaginians pay it all off, and they're doing great. Historians say that many of the remaining architectural wonders that are left over from Carthage, for example, the giant double harbor outside the ancient city, that all these things were built in the prosperous period between the Second and Third Punic War. So Carthage was really recovering and getting rich, and this started to really freak the Romans out. There was an important Senate delegation that was sent to North Africa in 153 BC, and it happened because the Numidians, under this same, now ancient Numidian king Massinissa, they were continually poking the Carthaginians, knowing that anytime the Carthaginians complained to the Romans would usually err on the side of the Numidians, their allies. So Massinissa took advantage of this and was always eating away at Carthaginian territory. So eventually he grabbed something that's so large, the Carthaginians turn to the Romans and say, "What are you going to do about this?" And the Romans send a delegation. This expedition includes a senator named Cato. Cato is a veteran of the Second Punic Wars. He's in his 70s by this time. He goes back to this ancient enemy and sees a powerful, rich state, which he didn't expect. He comes back to Rome determined to have another war with Carthage. He starts ending all of his speeches in the Senate, whether or not it has anything to do with foreign affairs, by saying, "Oh, and by the way, I am of the opinion that Carthage should be destroyed." At one speech, a very important speech, we're told, after saying this Carthage must be destroyed line for a long time, we're told in one of the great rhetorical tricks of all time, he allows a fig to fall from his toga. A particularly large, juicy fig. And he holds it up to the crowd and says, "This fig came from a mere 3 days away by ship." And what he was doing when he said that was appealing to the two sides of the Roman character that would be concerned about this. One side were the national security people, we would call them today. The people that were worried about threats to Rome. He had just told them that this rich state that could produce figs like this was only 3 days away by ship. Must have freaked out the people that were worried about Rome's defense. But the other group he was appealing to, the other senators that would be fodder for a message like this, were the ones who were greedy for more conquests. Look at the kind of fruit they were producing a mere 3 days away. We could have that place. And apparently the Romans decided that they were going to have that place. Now we have to remember that for this period, the sources that historians have to consult are few and far between, first of all. And what you do have is fragmentary and biased, and there's all kinds of problems with them. But it seems that Rome was trying their best to find a reason to spark a war with Carthage. And remember, they had sort of set up this reason in the peace deal of the Second Punic War.
Ready for a war?
The hidden poison pill in the whole treaty. The Roman Numidian allies under Massinissa, who's now in his 70s or 80s, still leading the Numidian people. We're told that the Numidians have been taking advantage of their Roman allied help and nibbling at Carthaginian territory all around. Finally, the Carthaginians, after going to the Romans and saying, are you going to stop this? Are you going to stop this over and over again? Finally, they declare war on the Numidians. And it may have been that the Romans had told Massinissa to do something so outrageous that the Carthaginians would go to war, because, of course, that would violate the Second Punic Wars Treaty. It would give the Romans a reason to go to war. And when the Carthaginian armies started fighting with the Numidian armies, they did just this. This is where some of the ancient historians say that Rome besmirched her honor somewhat, because she had obviously made a decision to provoke war with Carthage. She was just looking for a reason, and she didn't tell the Carthaginians this until she had wrung all sorts of concessions from them.
Trade route.
For example, when the Roman delegation arrived at Carthage to tell them that war was going to be declared, the Roman fleet had already set sail. So essentially the delegation arrived at Carthage and says, we're going to war with you, and by the way, the fleet will be here any minute. We're told that this astonished the Carthaginians. And they scrambled to try to find a way to satisfy whatever the Roman demands were. So they went to the Romans and said, what do we need to do?
We want your city.
The Romans told them, you need to give us 300 of your children as hostages. Your noble children. And the Carthaginian ambassadors didn't want to do this because the Romans were providing no guarantees or no timelines on when these kids were going to be returned. But we're told they just didn't have any options. So they turned over the 300 children to the Romans. You read Appian when he talks about the reaction of the Carthaginian families to their children being carted off by the Romans. Here's what Appian says. The Carthaginians had some suspicion of this Senate resolution, since there was no security given for the return of the hostages. Nevertheless, the danger was so great that they could omit nothing in which hope could be placed. So, anticipating the appointed time, they sent their children into Sicily, amid the tears of the parents, the kindred, and especially the mothers, who clung to their little ones with frantic cries, and seized hold of the ships and of the officers who were taking their children away, even holding on to the anchors and tearing at the ropes and throwing their arms around the sailors in order to prevent the ships from moving. Some of them even swam out far into the sea beside the ships, shedding tears and gazing at their children. Some of them tore out their hair on the shore and smote their breasts in the extremity of their grief.
Give your fair response. Now
you can imagine the trauma that this was doing to Carthage. But they thought if it saved the city, it was worth it. What they didn't know was that the Romans were intent on destroying the city. This wasn't enough. The Romans came back and said, well, if you are a people that really favor peace, you wouldn't have any need for weapons, would you? Turn over all your weapons in the city to us. The Carthaginians were freaked out by this because they were fighting a bit of a civil war in their territory. They also had to deal with the Numidians, but they felt they had no choice. So they turned over 200,000 suits of armor. The historians say innumerable javelins and darts, 2,000 catapults for throwing pointed missiles and stones. And they went back to the Romans and said, okay, are we good? And the Romans said, no, now we need you to abandon the city of Carthage. Move it 10 miles inland so that you have no access to the sea. This, of course, stunned the ambassadors.
These guys have experience.
300 children were supposed to be enough.
That concerns me.
When it wasn't, they thought that the disarming of the city was supposed to be enough. Now they were told that they had to leave the city and destroy it and move 10 miles inland. They said to the Romans, you told us that if we did all these things, Carthage would be preserved. And the Romans pulled a legalistic, read the fine print sort of trick on the Carthaginians, and the Roman consul said, well, we considered the Carthaginian people to be Carthage, not the structures and the tombs and the temples and all that. When the Romans make this point to the Carthaginians, the ambassadors go berserk. The best historian we have for this period is a guy named Appian, writing, a long time afterwards, but probably working from contemporary sources. And Appian gives an extremely dramatic account of the way that the ambassadors reacted to all this. He writes, while the Roman consuls were still speaking, the Carthaginian ambassadors lifted their hands toward heaven with loud cries and called on the gods as avengers of violated faith. They heaped reproaches on the Romans, as if willing to die, or insane, or determined to provoke the Romans to a sacrilegious violence against ambassadors. They flung themselves on the ground and beat it with their hands and heads. Some of them even tore their clothes and lacerated their flesh as though they were absolutely bereft of their senses. They said after the first frenzy was past, there was a great silence and prostration as if of men lying dead. Appian writes, when their outcries ceased, there was another interval of silence in which they reflected that their city was without arms, that it was empty of defenders, that it had not a ship, not a catapult, not a javelin, not a sword, nor a sufficient number of fighting men, having lost 50,000 a short time ago against the Numidians. They had neither mercenaries, nor friends, nor allies, nor time to procure any. Their enemies were in possession of their children, their arms, and their territory. Their city was besieged by foes provided with ships, infantry, cavalry, and engines, while Massinissa, their other enemy, was on their flank. They beseeched the Roman consuls. They said, do not defile your reputation by an act so horrible to do and to hear, and which you will be the first in all history to perform. They said, Greeks and barbarians have waged many wars, and you Romans have waged many against other nations. But no one has ever destroyed a city whose people have surrendered before the fight, and who delivered up their arms and children, and submitted to every other penalty that could be imposed upon them.
Outnumbered 50%
They asked the
more.
Roman consuls not to push our calamities to the last extremity. But the Roman consuls had orders from the Senate to do exactly that. The consul gave some feeble speech about how the Carthaginians would do great away from the coastline, and they didn't need to be a seafaring people, and the sea would just tempt them into becoming trouble again. When the ambassadors realized that basically the consuls were saying, we're going to have war no matter what, they said, we're going to be killed by our own people before we even get this whole message out. They knew what would happen to them when they went back to Carthage, telling them that they had to move the city inland, after they had already given in on the demands for children and disarmament. The ambassador said, would you at least please take the Roman fleet and make a display outside the Carthaginian harbor so that the Carthaginian people are aware of the dangers they face? Maybe that will save our lives. Appian writes about the return of these ambassadors to Carthage with the Roman message, and how the people were thronged outside the city waiting to hear what the Romans had decided. Carthage at this time had a population of between 250 and 300,000 people. It was a big, big city. And at some point during the march of the ambassadors to the Senate chambers to give their report, the crowd becomes aware that it's bad news. And Appian writes about the pushing and the shoving and the screaming and the yelling and just the chaos in the city as the Carthaginian people try to figure out what's going on, knowing it's negative no matter what. Partway through the ambassador's report to the Carthaginian Senate, the senators start screaming when they realize what's going on. And Appian writes that the people hearing these screams burst into the Senate chamber screaming also. And he writes, then followed a scene of indescribable fury and madness, such as the Maenads are said to enact in the Bacchic mysteries. Some fell upon those senators who had advised giving the hostages and tore them to pieces, considering them the ones who had led them into a trap. Others treated in a similar way those who had favored giving up the arms. Some stoned the ambassadors for bringing the bad news, and others dragged them through the city. Still others, meeting certain Italians who were caught amongst them in this sudden and unexpected mischance, maltreated them in various ways, saying that this would make them suffer for the fraud practiced upon them in the manner of the hostages and the arms. Appian says, most of all was the anger kindled by the mothers of the hostages, who, like the Furies in a tragedy, accosted those whom they met with shrieks, and accused them of giving away their children against their protest, or mocked at them, saying that the gods were now taking vengeance on them for the lost children. He writes, a few kept their wits about them, closed the gates, and brought stones upon the walls to be used in place of catapults. Carthage declares war on Rome at that point, frees all their slaves and tries to enroll them in the Carthaginian army the same way the Romans did when Hannibal had defeated them at Cannae. Put a couple of generals in charge of things, both of them confusingly named Hasdrubal, but not related to Hannibal's family. We're told that the fact that they know there's no way out of this bolsters the courage of the Carthaginians, who begin, Appian says, turning all the sacred places and temples and every other occupied space into workshops, where men and women work together day and night without pause, taking their food by turns on a fixed schedule. Each day they made 100 shields, 300 swords, 1,000 missiles for catapults, 500 darts and javelins, and as many catapults as they could. For strings to bend them, the women cut off their hair for want of other fibers.
Foot archery, Dodge.
Carthage is in a total war state, the women shaving their head to provide the ropes for the catapults that the Carthaginian people are frantically
What the
building.
hell, their hair?
The sources say that the Romans were overconfident and didn't rush the city, which gave the city time to put up a resistance and to stiffen. It would take the Romans 3 years to break into Carthage. And the commander of this attack had a familiar name.
Oh, these
It was
jerks
Scipio.
again.
This, the adopted son of Scipio Africanus, now dead, which made him the grandson of the elder Scipio, who first faced Hannibal in 218 BC on the other side of the Alps. What a continuity. And Carthage was not easily overcome. The defenses were unbelievable. They were supposed to have 20 miles of walls ringing the city, had its own double harbor where supplies could be brought into a besieged city. They had a 60-foot wall surrounding this city of 300,000 people or so. It was supposed to be 30 feet wide, and there was a ditch 60 feet wide in front of it, with a wooden palisade on top. The Romans would be camping outside those walls for 3 years. Imagine being inside the city of Carthage, and your children are growing up under siege. You can look from the walls any day you want to and see the Romans camped outside, waiting to break in and kill you. At some point, Carthaginian morale must have been fading, because Appian writes of a measure that the general in charge of the city's defense took to stiffen resistance. He writes, Hasdrubal took the Roman prisoners whom he had, brought them upon the walls in full sight of their comrades, and tore out their eyes, tongues, and tendons with iron hooks. Some of them he lacerated the soles of the feet. He cut off the fingers of others, and some he flayed alive. All who survived these tortures he hurled from the top of the walls. He thus gave the Carthaginians to understand that there was no possibility of peace with the Romans, and sought to fire them with the conviction that their only safety was in fighting. Apparently this had the reverse effect. The Carthaginians bewailed this move by their general. Some of the Carthaginian senators protested, and then he had them put to death. The military assured that no one was going to talk about surrender. Sometime in the next 3 years, in 146 BC, the Romans found a way over the walls of Carthage. We're told they found a tower that was of a similar height to walls nearby, and the Romans threw planks and boards across to provide a bridge, and they ran over the walls into the city, and the Carthaginians were surprised to find Roman troops in the city. And the Romans started capturing people, and the Carthaginians all fled to the big hill that formed the center, we're told, of Carthage. It was called the Bursa, and it was fortified, and it was the old center of the city. People ran up there to take refuge. There were 3 or 4 major streets in Carthage that had apartment buildings lining them on both sides, 6 stories high. You don't think of ancient cities being this urban. And the Romans began to fight for these buildings in vicious urban street fighting. At this point, the historian Appian begins to tell the tale of the death of this ancient great city
Mastery of the waves.
in a way that makes you feel like he took it from a source, an eyewitness. Polybius was there. Maybe it was his text that Appian used to describe the death of this city. But listen to what this ancient historian says happened after Scipio and his troops got in the walls of Carthage. And imagine seeing this in high definition, Blu-ray. Imagine CBS News or the BBC reporting live from the death of Carthage. That's what Appian is doing. It's the ancient version of reporting live from the scene. Appian says, Now Scipio hastened to attack the Bursa, the strongest part of the city, where the greater part of the inhabitants had taken refuge. There were 3 streets ascending from the forum to this fortress, along which, on either side, were houses built closely together, and 6 stories high, from which the Romans were assailed with missiles. They were compelled, therefore, to possess themselves of the first ones, and use those as a means of expelling the occupants of the next. When they had mastered the first houses, they threw timbers from one to another over the narrow passageways, and then crossed as if on bridges. While war was raging in this way on the rooftops, another fight was going on amongst those who met each other in the streets below. All places were filled with groans, shrieks, shouts, and every kind of agony.
Stealing my thunder.
Some were stabbed. Others were hurled alive from the roofs to the pavement, some of them landing on the heads of spears or other pointed weapons or swords. No one dared to set fire to the houses on account of those who were still on the roofs, until Scipio reached the Bursa. Then he set fire to all 3 streets together and gave orders to keep the passageways clear of burning material so that the army might move back and forth freely. Then came new scenes of horror. As the fire spread and carried everything down, the soldiers did not wait to destroy the buildings little by little, but all in a heap, so that the crashing grew louder, and many corpses fell with the stones into their midsts. Others were seen still living, especially old men, women, and young children who had hidden in the inmost nooks of the houses, some of them wounded, some more or less burned and uttering piteous cries. Still others thrust out and falling from such a height with the stones, timbers, and fire, were torn asunder in all shapes of horror, crushed and mangled. Nor was this the end of their miseries, for the street cleaners who were removing the rubbish with axes, mattocks, and forks, and making the roads passable, tossed with these instruments the dead and the living together into holes in the ground, dragging them along like sticks and stones and turning them over with their iron tools. Trenches were filled with men, some who were thrown in head first, with their legs sticking out of the ground, writhing a long time. Others fell with their feet downward and their heads above ground. Horses ran over them, crushing their faces and skulls, not purposely on the part of the riders, but in their headlong haste. Nor did the street cleaners do these things on purpose, but the tug of war, the glory of approaching victory, the rush of the soldiery and the orders of the officers, the blasts of the trumpets, tribunes and centurions marching, their cohorts hither and thither, all together made everybody frantic and heedless of the spectacle under their eyes. 6 days and nights were consumed in this kind of fighting, the soldiers being changed so that they might not be worn out with toil, slaughter, want of sleep, and these horrid sights. Scipio alone toiled without rest, hurrying here and there without sleep, taking food while he was at work until, utterly fatigued and relaxed, he sat down on a high place where he could overlook the work. We're told that after 6 days of this, some of the citizens came forward with olive branches, the traditional token of submission, and Scipio allowed 50,000 men and women out the narrow gate. They were going to be sold into slavery. He wanted the Roman deserters, of course, which the Romans always paid close attention to. No mercy for the deserters. And we're told that a giant fire was built by the deserters up on the Bursa in the fortress that the Romans hadn't taken yet, and they began to just jump into the fire. It was an easier death than what the Romans had planned for them. The deserters killed themselves. There are stories of Carthaginian women killing their children and throwing them into the fire with themselves.
Oh, shit.
You must imagine this moment as a Götterdämmerung for the Carthaginian state. A genocide on a massive scale. The wiping out of a culture, nation, people, and race. Where's the Carthaginian DNA today? You may have some in you. And if so, your relatives were being killed on a massive scale. We're told that even, the Roman general, Scipio Aemilianus, cried when he saw this. Polybius says he cried right in front of him, and then quoted a line from the Iliad, a line about the fall of Troy. And when asked why he was crying, he told Polybius that he foresaw the same thing happening to Rome eventually. And here he was looking at what it was going to look like. Interesting to think of these hard-bitten Roman generals in tears, but you can imagine what the sight must have been like. It's interesting to note, too, in 146 BC, when Scipio was doing this to Carthage, another Roman commander was doing the exact same thing in almost equal amounts of violence to the ancient city of Corinth in Greece. The Romans were beginning to put their stamp on the Mediterranean world, and it was a bloody stamp. But depending on the way you look at it, the Carthaginians might have had their revenge. Because in a similar way to a scorpion or a snake stinging the person who's killing it, they injected a sort of a poison into the Roman Republican system. because all of the money that was pouring into Rome began to change it. All of the slaves pouring into Rome began to change it. All of the wars that the Romans were fighting because they were busy conquering the world in self-defense, these wars started because of the Carthaginian war with Rome.
Dude, it's slow. Oh,
And finally,
dude, I got my
the
reinforcements.
military
Hold on.
changes that were required for the Romans to
It's,
beat the Carthaginians made it possible in later
T55,
years for people like
1055T.
Marius.
Divinity.